unsullied by us humans, sex is a very good part of human life.
We live our lives in a great deal of hypocrisy, telling our children to do one thing while we do something else.
The quest for control. We all would love it if our lives were a bit more controllable.
Discussions within the Christian community about these questions will be primary for the survival of the Christian community.
I'm going to do something a little different today. I've been privileged and blessed in the past. I've probably had the opportunity at least 5 times to present here. And I've always presented a finished product because I think many of the things I've talked about from an evangelical perspective have not been controversial. I think we all know where we stand on major issues such as abortion, euthanasia, et cetera, and a lot of the things spoken about at the conference. But I've been struggling, and this is specifically in my role more now as an educator than as a physician in practice, with the state of professionalism in young physicians. And I think we're seeing more and more as those young physicians mature in practice that we have a crisis that's been identified nationally with the entire spectrum of what it means to be a professional in medicine. And so even though I'm at an evangelical center, I'm going to use the term evolution. What's happening here is an evolving thing with me. I'm in the process of writing a paper about trying to construct a reasonable curriculum that I could present my worldview perspective as an evangelical and at a secular institution, and in some way contribute to the molding and nurturing of young physicians in the area of professionalism. What I'm going to do is just read a preface and read parts of the paper and pause and then just discuss them with you. Because this is a work in progress, I really covet later on, if you see me, suggestions, because much of what I discuss is really outside my realm of expertise, because I'm going to talk about using literature as one way to engage the important issues of our time for young physicians in training. So I begin. The Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity has continued to exhaustively survey the prevailing landscape of ethical issues relevant to contemporary medicine. And I stopped just for a second saying I think that's really happened here at the institutes and all the other conferences preceding this one. Themes such as death and dying, euthanasia, cloning and gene therapy, abortion, now stem cell research, HMOs and justice and allocation decisions, as well as many others, are examples, I think solid examples, of evangelical engagement with the postmodern ethos. On a fundamental level, though, and that's what I want to talk about today, do the ethical issues mentioned, and as you saw, they are representing disparate locations in time during humanity's earthly sojourn, if you will, they display a womb-to-tomb variety, so to speak. Do they anywhere have a final common denominator? And I asked, didn't the earliest bioethics institutes here at Trinity and the yearly conferences stress medicine's philosophic and theologic undergirding by a Christian Hippocratic tradition? So today I stand before you risking an accusation of simplistic reductionism, and I ask you to please bear with me. Could it be, however, that the postmodern's difficulty in defining authentic medical professionalism, especially that professionalism squarely placed in the context of a dangerously discarded Hippocratic tradition, made this account in great part for the entropy inherent in postmodern bioethical discourse? So I ask you to permit me to present a preliminary curriculum in professionalism during our time together. We will share a paper in progress, and that's what it is, which is developing a curriculum for young physicians in training through a great book seminar. Each step along the way will look at the rationale, needs assessment, content, and evaluation of this one attempt to reinstate the tradition of professionalism in medicine through education. That's just a preface, and I'm going to go to the intro to the paper, which I'm still working on, but for my evangelical audience, what I want to display in the intro, I put in the quotes, reaping what you sow, the entropy of postmodernism in medical professionalism. You're telling a young generation, every opinion is equally true, and they're telling us what their opinion about professionalism is every day. If I take 100 different students in residence, I get 100 different opinions on every topic. And so there's been a national effort to try to protect what's left of medical professionalism from the postmodern ethos. And so what I quoted in the paper was, in a laudable effort to stand firmly in support of the values, and I quote here, that make medicine honored and honorable, close quotes, inculcating the principles of professionalism to physicians in training has become an educational priority. The imperative has taken many forms, including but not limited to project professionalism. There's increased attention in major medical journals. There's specialized conferences, professional development committees, and extracurricular in many U.S. medical schools, and probably soon to be all U.S. medical schools. Jordan J. Cohen, who's a very well-known educator, who's the head of what we call the AAMC, the American Association of Medical Colleges, he says professionalism on display has such holistic power that it is integral to the so-called hidden curriculum, which means that the way I act in front of my residents is going to go a long way in them seeking some sort of role model for professional behavior. I observed that two issues fundamental to the educational mission act as confounding variables, so to speak, and should be considered. From a strictly agreed upon definition of professionalism is very difficult to attain. I think we here could come up with a very excellent consensus, but when I move in society, a consensus fragments very quickly. And most people will agree that altruism, accountability, excellence, duty, honor, and integrity and respect for others as positive attributes make up some of what it means to be a professional in medicine, whether it be physician, nurse, etc. But what's really unique about our culture today, contemporary culture, there's a lot of negative issues that people don't consider when they train young physicians. Unionization. Should doctors and nurses be allowed to have a union? That is a question relevant to professionalism. Perverse financial incentives. If you're invited to a dinner where you're wined and dined and paid $500 to hear about an antibiotic, is that perverse? Are you going to prescribe it not because it's good, but because you've been paid to evaluate that antibiotic positively? Institutional Review Board misadventures. I talked about that last year, and I felt like I'm some sort of ongoing prophet. Johns Hopkins got their doors shut down, as did their IRB. They lost all federal grant funding this week when they killed a patient during a research study, a human research study, without appropriate informed consent. One more institution. It's happened at Duke. It's happened at University of Illinois. It's happened at Rush. So it's another new contemporary assault on professionalism. Managed care financial dilemmas are what we call the corporate transformation of medicine. I feel some mornings when I hear the terminology where I work, I don't work at a hospital anymore, I work at a bank. Physician impairment. Something really critical to this generation. How do we handle that? If I have a physician's impairment committee, you can bet everyone on that committee will feel awkward about inviting students and physicians to the meetings because respected people are going to be discussed and confidentiality is going to become essential. And finally, and as every one of us knows who deals in the profession, continued erosion of patient trust in the profession itself has been thrust to the forefront. And I think that you all understand what I'm saying there. We need to freshly look at professionalism, not with what the traditional values alone we know about as Christians, but find some way to deal morally with a postmodern culture in terms of how they approach these other negative burdens that have been tossed on the profession within the last 5 to 10 years. And second, and more germane, and I guess I'm more of a stubborn blockhead here, I think I'm talking to people who would have understood this, project professionalism is a little packet. I didn't bring it. Every reference in there is a medical article. So physicians, and obviously we know physicians do not have an ego. So physicians sit down and say, we're going to determine the literature for professionalism and not engage any other person who's thought about this. We don't care what nurses think, sociologists, et cetera, right down the line. Why don't we open up and start to take advantage of other people who've looked at this in other contexts, literature, for example. And someone wrote an article recently, and her quote was brilliant. She says, why don't you, talking to physicians since she's a PhD, call for an intellectual widening of the medical curriculum relevant to professionalism, reconceptualize, and include other relevant bodies of knowledge, doctors, and that includes philosophy, sociology, literature, spirituality, something we need to discuss with young physicians more, and revolutionize a static and sectarian approach. And I said, wow, she's right 100%, rather than sending people who I'm telling to read medical literature 18 hours a day home to read more medical literature concerning professionalism. Why don't we find some way to freshen the curriculum and get them to engage other areas of knowledge? And well, it fell into my lap pretty quickly. Evanston had already had a great book seminar, which was used to engage questions in medical ethics. And so I said, why don't we look at the book titles you have, reframe the questions, and let's look at questions in medical professionalism as well as ethics, and see if we can get the students in this and residents in this forum to talk more openly and look for better role modeling. One of the quotes they provided was by an author named Anne Hawkins, and she wrote, and this should be, I think, clearly evident, those involved in giving or receiving health care appear to be running up against limitations of the philosophical or medical model for ethics, and we could apply that to professionalism. These issues are inextricably related to all other issues in the care of a given patient. Literature and its theories seem especially able to focus on this broader and more complex picture. Another writer, Catherine Hunter, who is a proponent of narrative theory in ethics and professionalism, wrote, and I quote her, "Narrative is the source and agent of both the knowledge of others and a sense of moral or professional community. Moral choice must be seen not simply as a matter of logic or preference exercised in the moment, but as a longer process intertwined with history, which postmoderns don't want to hear and they mistrust, with identity, culture, and something critical, life's meaning." And so I somewhat commandeered the Great Book Seminar series, which was done one Tuesday evening a month, every month, but June, July, and August, and said, let's redo the curriculum, take all the issues we're seeing relevant to professionalism, put them into that context, and see if we can get the residents and students involved in the discussion. Let me digress for just a minute. Some of you are professional educators, and I'm going to bring up something that most educators have to do with curricula, and usually is dry, but I'm going to show you something about where we are at this point in time with professionalism. I knew I wanted to publish at at some point in time, so I did a needs assessment survey. We just asked 5 simple questions, like, can you define what are the learned professions? We asked one question, which retrospectively, as a sports fanatic, I should not have placed, and I said, is the Chicago Bears quarterback a, quotes, professional? Very bad maneuver, because most of the people, 500 answered the survey, said if it's Cade McNown, no. And that was not my intent. I wanted some learning content out of that one. But let me tell you something, in terms of the needs assessment, 3 out of 500 gave even a reasonable definition of what it meant to be a physician who was a professional, including, and I'm not telling you this to shock you, it was in there, this was anonymous. When they came to interview, we interviewed about 500 people a year for our PGY1 slots in transitional, categorical, and preliminary medicine. One answered that if he had to use the word in a sentence, he said a hitman is a professional, because that's what they call them in the movies. And so that's where we're starting at the most fundamental level of trying to tell a generation who's been weaned on postmodernism, subjective and affective learning, mistrust of meta-narratives, about where we're starting. My predecessor, who the chair I hold is named after, once said to me, the job's impossible. Mom and Dad should have done it a long time ago. But that's what we're up against. We're getting a generation that can't even define what it is we're trying to teach them. And so let me go over with you, and I think many of you probably could expand my curriculum. Let me tell you some of the limitations. We have found that the longer the book, the lower the attendance. So we have switched somewhat more now to short stories. We've tried to give maybe 2 short stories for discussion that are relevant to professionalism that I expect a resident should be able to read in approximately an hour. When we've utilized books before, especially longer books, we've had a problem. So I'm going to read to you some of the books that have been in the curriculum, and then maybe close a little bit at the end with some of the shorter stories that have been substituted to maintain attendance. And the other thing that's been done, we've now tried a couple things. I'm starting to have a Saturday office, and if the attendance goes down, they're mandated to come with me to my Saturday office, which is considered something they don't want to do. So even with the longer books now, our attendance has been going up. Raising 2 teenage boys have really taught me how to be a teacher, I have to admit. But let me go over some of the readings. If you see me later and you have ideas about readings, and I'll bet many of you have read literature that we could put into a secular environment and then frame, we have the story, the gospel, get the people in a room thinking about what's lacking, and then get them to discuss it with us. If you have titles like that, please feel free either here or by email to share them with me. One now, particularly in the age generation that had been used elsewhere, was The Plague by Albert Camus, and I'll read a short summary. Many of you have read it, and I've come up with another title that they like reading more, but The Plague, Dr. Riot conscientiously and determinedly helps the victims of a plague that overwhelms his town, and as you know, his worldview perspective is almost like Sartre, the contemporary of Camus, existential, no God. He faces the challenges of disease, conviction, and with physical and moral stamina. A much better book that I've really gotten residents to read, and it's written by a physician, but he's very gifted in prose, is Abraham Verghese's My Own Country, and I don't know how many of you know about that. He was a physician in a small community, which I'm blanking now, in Tennessee, and he, as an ID specialist, started to care for all the patients with AIDS, and then was immediately shocked for such a small community what a high percentage of patients he had with HIV infection and AIDS. It so consumed him, was so early in the era. You talk about Jesus' response to leprosy, one of the greatest moves in the gospel. His wife wouldn't let him touch his child, his baby at home, because she was afraid he would give the baby AIDS. And he goes over all the things that happened. He finally found out what he saw was because it was such a small community, many of the homosexuals in the community left to go to New York and bigger cities and came home to die. It took such a toll in his real life. He divorced and he moved, and he lost his faith. Though his name is Indian, he was raised Christian. And so it can be read, I think, fairly comfortably in a couple days. Really gets at some of the issues of care for patients that people sometimes think are pariahs, and some other ways to share the gospel. So I've used it as a substitute for The Plague, which a lot of people find more difficult to read. Another fairly classic they had used, and we've used a little bit, now I'm going to expand in the context of using it to teach about the downsides of HMOs, is Ward Number 6 by Chekhov. You know, the physician, Andre, he lives a comfortable and detached life as the town doctor. Doesn't visit his patients in a psychiatric ward. He's very smug, and he believes they're just as well off there with him or without him. His philosophy changes when he visits the ward one time and begins a conversation, and I think anyone going to medical school should read it. I think it really sheds a lot of light. We've had some very, very good discussions about that, and I'll expand on that a little bit when I talk to you about why I choose it to discuss HMOs. Enemy of the People, which is a drama, some of you know. It's a really interesting story. What it talks about, Dr. Thomas Stockman discovers that the town baths, essential to the tourist industry, are polluted. He makes a concerted moral stand to expose the pollution and incurs the censure of his community, being proclaimed an enemy of the people. Conflict of interest, working for an HMO, release of information. It's very easy with that drama, which is not exceedingly long, to get people involved in that conversation. We've used the doctor's dilemma about making moral choices about treatment. A doctor is faced with a choice. Which of two people will he save, a poor doctor or a talented scoundrel? As if the two are exclusive groups. Professional and personal arrogance lead him to this disconcerting decision. And for curriculum purposes, what I've done when we get reviewed by agencies, obviously when we read that, we discuss arrogance, conflict of interest, and integrity, so that we have the main, at least agreed upon, traditional areas of professionalism, and then try to bring it into a more contemporary sphere. We've read Frankenstein, for obvious reasons. We've read The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Recently, they discussed Master and Man by Tolstoy. For those of you who have not read it, and I had not read it prior to this, a businessman stubbornly pushes his servant to lead the two of them further into a terrible snowstorm in his eagerness to make a business deal in another town. The blizzard paralyzes them, and the businessman reflects upon a lifetime of greed in his desperate efforts to protect his servant as they face death together. And we use that, and I think I do not have to elaborate why young physicians need to discuss and at least engage a story like that. I mentioned earlier one of the hardest things I have had to teach about is physician impairment, and I think physician impairment has been, and is a particular reality. We have used two stories to do that, since I cannot do it, as I mentioned earlier, in the context of a impaired physicians committee. One is not a very difficult one to read. Some of you may have read Doc Rivers by William Carlos Williams, and the story is Doc Rivers has taken care of generations of families in a small town for decades. He's loved by his patients and respected by his colleagues, and he develops an addiction to morphine. What's really interesting is to see how the community responds. Some patients actually get treated well by him while he's high, and they actually compliment the fact that he's able to handle morphine simultaneously with the good practice of medicine, and many choose to look deferentially away. There's no way to read that story with students and residents and not get everybody in the room to immediately identify what the problem is. Let me tell you about the tennis partner, which is the other story, physician impairment, again written by Abraham Verghese. And I find that I met him, he did rounds at our hospital, and part of the reason why young physicians will read him is he is a marvelous clinician. Sometimes there's a mistrust saying, well, it's really an outsider writing about medicine. Verghese's an insider who's paid his dues ministering to a population with AIDS. And he talks about an actual story, protecting names, of where he dealt with a young physician who was impaired. He had a friendship between himself and a medical student who he names David Smith. And what I ask them when they read the story is, what would you do or what should you do with the knowledge that Verghese has about his student who has a substance abuse? So in the following passages from the title, The Tennis Partner, because they played tennis together, Verghese confronts his student, tennis partner, and friend, hearing that he's working in clinic after having recently used cocaine. And this is Verghese's quote: "I wasn't angry yet. Instead, I felt tremendously sorry for David. I wanted to throw up a wall around us and protect him. I knew how much it cost him to say yes, to admit to using to me. I stumbled past him down the corridor, needing to find a place where we could be out of earshot. It was my face I worried about now, that I would give it away." And so our commentary led to the fact that an accomplished and respected physician has faced the painful challenge of a friend's dangerous weakness. Verghese's torn between respect for his professional duty to report him and loyalty to his friend. David, at this point in time, posed no threat to patients, but Verghese covered for him so that he wouldn't threaten patients. Was his covering an act of friendship or an ethical lapse? Is his action consistent with a normative definition of professionalism? And another quote to show how severe things got in the relationship, and this is Verghese: "What next? What to do with this sobbing, wretched figure? Turn him in, of course. Expose the mischief. But even as I thought of turning him in, my mind was also asking whether this lapse of his could be concealed. What if it were a one-time lapse, a momentary weakness, a slip, not a complete fall off the wagon? If I was ever going to turn him in, the moment for that had passed. The fact that I was debating what to do, engaging in a dialogue with him, gave me away. I had already capitulated. When the heat was on, the role that we both had slipped into that defined us was that of friends and equals, and he was never able to confront the crisis." And so I found that that is one way, without endangering confidentiality, to at least get young physicians in training to recognize the problem, even if not be able to decide what they would do in that instance. Just to give you some idea what we've confronted in terms of the wanting to read shorter and shorter things, we've consulted a soon-to-be PhD, convinced him with a little moonlighting money, a soon-to-be PhD at Northwestern University, to help us understanding our dilemma in terms of how much reading people in medicine are willing to do, and they have a whole host of reading to do for rounds when they're up at night, etc. And he has been choosing the short stories. The first session I went to, one of the two short stories he chose was about a very well-to-do Australian who had lived his entire life in Sydney, who decided when he retired at a very early age, because he had so much money, that he always wanted to be a farmer and a country person, that he would move to the country. And when he did, after he bought a very large farm, after years, he never fit in. It was the city folk coming to the country. The second short story he chose was about a lottery. And after he chose those and I read them, I sat down and said, either this guy's going to be the greatest teacher I've ever met, or this is going to be the biggest flop I've ever gone to, because I had no idea where he was going, particularly since he was not a physician. He did a marvelous job and sustained 90 minutes of discussion with the residents, taking the first one, asking them if they ever feel when they talk to patients in their jargon that they're the city folk who never adjusted to being in a country. And it really opened up a lot of feeling by the residents about the times. We have a PhD ethicist come by, and he has to stop our residents every 12 milliseconds for their abbreviations. If they're not conscious with him, not understanding what they're saying, are they conscious with patients and their family? Mom has TTP, she needs plasmapheresis, and the person sitting there not understanding them. So it really made them develop, I think, and I've seen it more on rounds, some insight. The second one was the lottery, and what he was really getting to is, do sick people lose in a lottery, or is there some bigger purpose in life? I don't know him well enough yet to tell him his worldview perspective, but one of the residents is a naval officer, and she's an unbeliever. And I did not know until that time. See, the guard comes down like it doesn't come down on rounds. We're sitting around dinner. I did not know that her soon-to-be husband was a F-16 pilot, and he crashed on approach to his aircraft carrier 2 weeks before the wedding and died. And she really believes that there is no God and that life is a lottery. So I stopped her after the conference and told her I disagreed with her. And she's agreed on a couple occasions to come talk to me about why my beliefs are different than hers. And so this has been, I think, a very good avenue to confront issues that I can't confront in a large group the same way, and in a way that I can get them to engage issues that can get them at least to look with a little more depth at my worldview perspective. I'm running down on time, and I wouldn't mind opening to questions, and if you don't want to ask a question, you'd like to comment or suggest something else I could add to the curriculum, I would be just as happy with that, so I'll open the floor. Please, there's 2 people in. All right.
I went to a fairly reputable medical school, so I won't mention the name. But my reason in telling you that is I didn't read the Hippocratic Oath till we were all dressed up, you know, ready to get our diplomas. And having recently read Nigel Cameron's book, where he talks very, you know, eloquently about the Hippocratic Oath, what would be wrong with that book for your group of
We did it, and I thank you for bringing that up. We did you know, it was really too bad. We had a different discussant then from the University of Chicago, and he got bogged down in the very, very early part of the oath, and he spent a lot of time trying to discuss the fact that teachers were respected during the time of the Hippocratic tradition because there were no books or discs to learn from. We never really got to the meat, which I think you're right, Nigel Cameron eloquently describes in The New Medicine, but we have done that, and I think you have to do that. 2 medical schools in North America do the oath unabridged. There's an awful lot of medical schools that don't. People are convinced the Geneva Convention is similar to the oath, and that is not at all true. And most of the time you sit down and try to make distinctions between, you know, Margaret Mead was not someone who was grinding an axe for Christianity, said it was one of the greatest writings of all time because it separated, hopefully forever, it did not, black and white medicine. Doctors don't kill and heal at the same time. So those are the kind of things I would like to discuss in that context when we got bogged down. So I think you're right, and that can be added. And because it has such a historical significance, I don't think anybody in the room is going to say that we're bludgeoning someone with a Christian document. So I thank you for your observation.
And just a comment, you're on the right track. I mean, I really,
thank you.
Especially choosing the short stories. I think you're just recognizing the reality of the situation, and I think it's a great idea.
Thank you.
This may be a little bit lighter weight even. A consideration might be, since in postmodernism the priest is out because he's not authoritative anymore, and even the scientist is now discredited. The spokesman for the times that has all the authority is the artist. And I was wondering if it would be worthwhile, just every once in a while, instead of having these poor guys read all this stuff, to maybe play contemporary music and evaluate the words that the authors are using, or even show video clips, something like that, that they don't have to invest a lot of time in, but can really spur some discussion.
Tremendous idea. The person who set up the ethics program, Dr. Adelson, who's now retired, if he did not get this PhD to do the literature, was going to invite, he has a lot of contacts at the Art Institute, he's been involved in the arts all his life, the lyric opera and the symphony, was going to invite artists to look at works of art like you suggest and discuss them in the context of professionalism in medicine. So I think that's a really great idea, and I think that's still a possibility. Trinity had a conference 2-3 years ago where professors from other schools, and I won't forget the engineer, I think I can't remember, I think his last name was Bradley at Texas A&M, has a get-together over his home for his students, and he spends time, one video movie that really, he got a lot of people engaged to at least discuss morality, was the Woody Allen one, Crimes and Misdemeanors. And so there's a lot of ways, you know, you sit there, and I don't know if anybody's familiar with the story, he's trying to contrast the guilt in crime and punishment with a murder in this case, an ophthalmologist having an affair. The woman threatens to tell his wife he has her killed, and he doesn't feel guilty. And what he asks at the end of that, do you want to live in a society where even murder just gets the slightest twinge of guilt and life goes on? And he finds a way then to engage the audience. So I think that that's a very rich area. You know, a lot of movies have redemptive analogies, and people are seeking redemption, and we could offer our story of redemption. So I think it's a wonderful idea. If anybody else is doing that somewhere else, let me know.
That's heavier than I thought. I was thinking more like...
Lighter? That's fine.
Let them watch Tender Mercies and
Okay.
observe that the guy's a professional singer, but a pretty amateur too.
I think that's a good idea too. Yeah, I tend to go on the heavy side. I apologize. Middle-aged spread. Anyone else? If not, thank you.